Hey everybody, and welcome back to Practice Makes Faithful. Today we are in Season 3, Episode 2, and we have a great episode ahead of us. So I'm excited to dive into this. My name is Ben Patterson, joined as always by Paul Hugobart.
Yeah, good to be here with you this morning, Ben.
Yes, sir. Looking forward to diving into this. This will be, I think it's going to be some really good conversation today.
I think so. I agree.
Before we dive in, how's the week been?
Yeah, it's been good.
Groovy?
I think definitely my time, and we ended last week talking about the 21 days of prayer, fasting and prayer that we're inviting people into. And so really I'd say my week was flavored by, or maybe the tone for my week in many ways was set by these devotional thoughts pulled out of this prayer guide. And it's interesting to me, I was commenting to my wife, it's interesting having been the one that wrote those devotional thoughts. You go through and you write them, you're putting together these thoughts with other people in mind, and then I come back to it and I jump in on the journey as well. And, maybe not the words that I wrote, but definitely the words of Scripture pop out again to me and come alive again to me, having gone through and written the devotional guides, but then coming back and participating as well. There's a lot of deep meaning in what we're doing in the journey we're walking through right now. And so it's been good for me, kind of a spiritual, like a fresh breath of spiritual life. And so I hope that other people are experiencing that as well as they're spending time fasting, praying, and then allowing each one of those little nuggets maybe to shape their thoughts for the day forward. So so it's been a good week in that regard.
That's awesome.
So, and that's what we hope for others, so to get to experience that myself, it's a blessing.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I know that's been meaningful for me as well. I've been enjoying this. I tried a couple different things I hadn't done before, fasting-wise, this year, and it's been a really meaningful experience. Yeah,
there is something, and we've said it before, there is something in that experience that, many of us who have not spent time fasting, certainly, you're following Jesus, you're probably familiar with prayer. We most of us pray. In fact, I think it's a very high percentage of the North American population, when surveyed, says they pray. Even I think it's a higher number than people who actually claim to have faith, which is interesting. But to move to this level where we're adding the very intentional practice of fasting to it as well, there is this level of focus and purpose and intent that comes to that. And so, again, we'll invite people into this practice again at the end of the podcast. It's not too late to jump in and dedicate some time this month to prayer and fasting. But just to speak from my own personal experience, it sounds like yours as well. Some real rich, a very rich experience in our walk with God as we walk through this time of prayer and fasting.
Yeah, that's been good. Awesome. I mean, this is a time that's been kind of complementing this series that we're in right now called Clay. What is shaping you? What's shaping you? Yeah. And centered around that question. Are we being shaped by Jesus? Are we being shaped into disciples of His, or are we being shaped by the world, by culture? And today we're going to continue diving into some of these cultural forces that may be shaping us. Yeah. But before we do that, Paul, for anyone who just wasn't here last week, would you give us a quick recap of kind of where we got started, where this kind of idea Clay came from, and then we'll move into this week's message?
Yeah, so there are a number of passages in Scripture that bring out this imagery, this metaphor that we are clay being shaped and God is the potter. Now, there's the acknowledgement there, kind of if you read in between the lines, that there are many things that could shape us, and we've been making that acknowledgement as we share this in this series here at Grace Chapel, also obviously in this podcast too, that we are constantly, and in fact, I think I've said it this way, that life is a constant process of being shaped by things like the relationships that we have. If you're a Christ follower and you're in Scripture, by being shaped by God's Word and by the design and purpose that He's placed within us. But there are plenty of things that can shape us. I mean, there's the media content that we take in, and it's interesting. I think we talked about this last year. Barna had done some research and revealed that even Christians, young Christians, were being shaped at a 20-to-1 ratio. Where 20 is the number that you would tie to the hours of content they were consuming that had, maybe a very secular influence on them, or just, pop culture type influence. And then the one was, an hour of content they consumed that actually shaped them so that they would be more influenced by God at work in their lives. And so, so when you think about it that way, if we're being formed at a 20-to-1 ratio, and the culture is what's receiving, this kind of 20-fold influence, or is having this 20-fold influence upon our lives, we shouldn't be surprised when sometimes our lives don't really reflect the things of God, or when we start to adopt worldviews that actually are not at all Christian. We're more influenced by these other things that we're allowing to kind of shape us, mold us, that are pouring themselves into us constantly. And so that's kind of what we're talking about in this series. We're asking the question, what is shaping you? Because as we talked about in this message this Sunday, we have to be honest, is that we don't know often when something is shaping us.
Yeah.
We don't always know what is shaping us. And so to be unaware, which is often, I think, our reality, when we're not aware of what's happening around us, but it's still leaving an imprint upon us, well, that's dangerous. And it should take us to that place where we want to say, hold on, I don't want to be oblivious to the things going on around me. So we're asking that question, trying to have folks both here who are listening to the podcast and folks that are here on Sunday mornings with us. We're trying to move and provoke people to asking the question, what is shaping me?
Yeah.
What is it that is shaping me?
So, I think that's so right, that so often we're unaware of these subtle influences that slowly shape us, and we kind of, there's like a moment where you may wake up and you wonder, how did I get here? How did I get to this point? And it wasn't some big shift that happened. It was a little bit that was shaping you, just a bit, every day, over time. And eventually you get to a spot and wonder, how did I get here?
That's right.
And
that's right.
We don't want you to be in that spot.
Yes.
So
So adding more purpose and more intent to who we become. As part of the challenge of this series, I think. So I think that probably kind of gives just a quick snapshot of what we're looking at, what we're talking about this month, and why it really matters.
That's good. So tell us about this week's message. Where'd you get with this?
Yeah, so probably the most famous message that Jesus ever preached, and it's a collection of a lot of different things where he was kind of giving, some have called it Jesus' manifesto for life, for the life of his followers, Jesus' directive to those who would follow him. It's found in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know if they called it that, very early on or not. I think that's something, label that we put on it, as we kind of expect that Jesus stepped up onto this mountain that acted as sort of like an amphitheater, otherwise how could he, speak so that so many could hear him, a crowd maybe in the thousands listening. And he starts to share his vision for the lives of his followers. Beginning with talking about blessings and you're blessed if you're persecuted for my sake. You're blessed if you're poor in spirit. All these things that we would not necessarily equate as blessings. He also teaches his followers how to pray, and in that we see the Lord's Prayer. This is how you should pray: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. And so teaches them also how not to pray. And then he goes through this section as well where he has, and this is at the end of chapter 5, he's got this section where he says to them, you've heard it said, but I want to tell you, this is how it really ought to be. And I think what Jesus is actually doing in that section is acknowledging the influence of culture. So you've heard somebody say this. Some leader somewhere said, don't commit adultery. Okay, good, excellent. But I'm going to take this further, and I'm going to tell you that if you look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery within your heart. Okay, some leader somewhere, in Moses. So Moses would have said, don't murder. But I tell you, if you hate your brother, man, that's like killing them in your heart. And so Jesus is saying, look, here are things that we've valued, and wisely so, Now the eye for an eye, one tooth for a tooth, that's probably a little more, there is scripture to that. It's also Hammurabi's code in a sense. But, Jesus says, look, I want to tell you, I'd rather, instead of you thinking about looking for revenge, think about how you can give to somebody else, And so over and over, Jesus is taking these, you've heard it was said sayings, and giving his disciples, his followers, an entirely new way of living, saying this is a very countercultural way. If you're going to be like me, if you're going to follow me as your rabbi in that day, and the goal of the disciples, when they followed a rabbi, was to become just like that rabbi. And so Jesus is saying, in a sense, he's saying, this is the kind of person I am. This is who I was sent here to be. So if you're going to follow me, you're going to look like this. Okay, so he gives this kind of this dictate, this direction. He does it over the course of what in our Bibles is 3 chapters. Again, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And he gets to the end of chapter 7, and his kind of conclusion to this message is, okay, listen, you've all heard the things I've said. You've been listening the whole time. Okay, so I'm talking, as a speaker, I'm paying attention to your eyes. I know you've been engaged with me. So let me tell you, it's about a whole lot more than listening. I want you to put into practice the things that I've said. And so he concludes by saying this, so everybody who's heard these words of mine and then goes and puts them into practice, well, that person is like a wise man who built his house upon a rock, on a solid, firm foundation. So the rains came, the floods rose, the winds blew, and the house stood firm. I love kind of what Jesus is talking about there in the sense saying, look, the picture of life that I'm painting for you is a life built upon the solid foundation of God. This is a life that resounds with the heart of God. It connects directly to the heart of God. And so if you do that, the storms are still going to come, the winds are going to blow, the floodwaters are still going to rise. But if you build your life on this foundation, you can stand the storms of life. But if you hear these words and you turn around and you say, well, those were neat words, and then you don't put them into practice, that makes you like a foolish person who goes out and builds his house upon sand. And Jesus is saying, look, I'm giving you a vision for life. There are loads of other places that are giving you a vision for how to live life. Worldviews, in a sense, the worldviews that are being framed, stories that are being told about what is at the heart of life. If you want to live life and get the most out of life, here's how you're going to turn around and live. So there are loads of places that are giving directive, a vision for what life could be like. And it's the difference between solid ground, living out kind of the vision for life that I have cast for you, and sand. And we're all looking to build something. So what type of foundation do you want to build upon? And so, I think I love what Jesus is doing, because he is kind of, I think, painting for us this picture of contrasting worldviews. This reality that there are, different people have a different belief or different expectation at the heart of what life ought to be about. And so when you start to believe life is about this, it's going to impact the way you live. It's going to maybe shape the person you become. So the beliefs that you hold core and central in life shape the person that you become. Now that should come as no surprise to us, but Jesus was very plain about that. And so he's saying, look, you can allow your life to be shaped by multiple different things. Is it going to be me? Is it going to be God, your creator? Or is it going to be a lot of things that are distractions to that, and then competing messages and worldviews? And so I think that's kind of the heart of what this message was about, is, again, raising this awareness, as Jesus was doing for those who were listening to them. Look, there are loads of things seeking to shape you. Will your life be shaped by my words and by my life as well, or is it going to be shaped by something else?
That's good. So you, in the message, you then went on to talk about 8 different worldviews that have a formative shaping effect on our culture, and that are potentially shaping us as well. Even if we don't know it, even if we're not aware of it, these are forces that are at work in our world that are having a formative impact on us.
Yeah, very much so.
So I'd love to go through each of these ideologies, to talk about them, and to talk about why why this is important to be aware of these things, of what kind of impact they may be having on us.
Yes.
So I think you got these from a book, right?
Yeah, I can kind of show this book, and we'll link it in the show notes as well. So if you're watching, you'll see this book is called Hidden Worldviews, 8 Cultural Stories That Shape Our Lives, written by two guys, Steve Wilkins and Mark Sanford. This book was written in 2009, so it's now a 14-year-old book. But the things that they point out as these competing worldviews, or they actually call them lived worldviews. What they're saying, these are practical worldviews based upon what we observe people living for, what they've set as the target and goal in their lives based on the fruit that we see, in a sense.
Gotcha.
So some people would argue that, and there are a lot of theoretical worldviews that kind of arise out of the academic world, saying, and they discuss that to some degree in this book as well, that arise out of the academic world that would maybe say, here's what the meaning of life should be and here's how we would live toward it. What they're trying to do is to not begin with academics, they're trying to begin with observation and saying, when we observe people living, what can we conclude their beliefs must be by what they're chasing after? So how can we determine what someone believes the meaning of life must be? By what we observe as we examine their lives. So yeah, that's kind of what the goal of this is, and or what the goal of their writing is, and they call it hidden worldviews because of the acknowledgement that these are often things that lie just beneath the surface that most people are not aware of. They don't realize how much they're being shaped by some sort of belief that they have, and then beyond that, how faulty that belief truly is when you actually start to pick it apart. And that's true about a lot of the things that we believe that we haven't really taken time to examine. We as human beings are very capable of rationalizing, justifying our actions with some very faulty thought processes because somehow pursuing some of these things that we'll talk about, pursuing the end that is wrapped up in a particular worldview makes us feel good somewhere, somehow. But when you start to, in a sense, I'll use the word deconstruct, even though I know that's a somewhat kind of buzzword right now. But really, that's what Jesus spends time, in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, deconstructing the worldviews of those in his audience so that he can give them a better way of living. Yeah. And in a sense, that's what we're going to do. We talk about deconstruction a lot in relation to what a lot of people are doing with their Christian faith. But the reality is, or the worldview that their Christian faith has created, and sometimes a very faulty worldview as well, because the worldview was not rooted in Scripture, it was rooted in maybe institutional church life. Yeah. And so sometimes that's not all bad, deconstructing some of the faulty thoughts that our institutional church life has impressed upon us. But it's also very valid to go through and deconstruct some of these worldviews that many of us have not put much thought into as well. So deconstruction, is a knife that can cut at many different levels and at many different places. And so I think that's what we're going to do a little bit of in the next few minutes, is kind of deconstruct some worldviews that have some real flaws in them.
Yeah, and these are interesting because I remember just yesterday as you were unpacking this list, they were really striking to me, things that I may have not thought about or put on this list, things that I didn't realize had influenced me as much as it probably has. And they're kind of these silent forces that we may or may not be aware of, but that are having a really large impact on a lot of us.
That's right.
So
especially when we ask the question, what is really shaping us?
Yeah, and we had to move pretty quick in the message yesterday through these, and we'll still have to move at a decent pace today, but we can spend a little bit more time on it. So let's dive in to the first of these worldviews, which is individualism. So tell us first, what is individualism? Yeah, so
what Wilkins and Sanford say about individualism is that it's basically this belief that I exist at the center of the universe. That in a sense, nothing matters more than number one, me. I've got to look out for myself. And this very individualistic mindset is something that is is very much It has arisen out of our culture, our Western culture, Western thinking, and then also is something that is very much, I think, fostered within even early school environments. When we think, we're told, you can do anything you set your mind to. Mm-hmm. It's very you-centered. You can. So if you work hard, you can do anything you set your mind to. And what happens then is when we set these goals for our lives, especially if we embrace this individualistic mindset, that means that we're going to do anything to get to that goal, and then other people can become obstacles to our goals. If you pursue this rationale to its end, there are a lot of really unfortunate things that can happen along the way. So again, individualism is the belief that I exist at the center of the universe, that nothing matters more than what I want from my own life. Nothing matters more than what I can become. Nothing matters more than getting the things that I find valuable. Go ahead.
Are we saying that individualism is inherently bad?
Here's the reality. I think with each of these worldviews, there are some truths that you could find, and certainly Wilkins and Sanford acknowledge this in this book, Hidden Worldviews, that, for example, individualism that moves us to personal responsibility is not a bad thing. So when you look and reflect upon your life and say, how did I, especially when it comes to owning mistakes, how did I contribute to the problem that just happened, the problem that just occurred, or whatever negative situation happened, that's good. We ought to reflect upon those things and find personal ownership. But when you also look at yourself and say, I'm responsible for every good thing that happens in my life because I am maybe charting the course of my own destiny, that can be really bad. It denies the communal aspect of life as well. It can make us very it can make loners out of us, and loners become lonely. And so there are a lot of really negative things that have come about because of this very individualistic pursuit, or this pursuit of individualism, and the beliefs that come with it. Again, the idea primarily that I am the center of the universe, and so we elevate our own self-importance. We may become self-righteous. So all these negative words, and all these negative concepts that we can think of that become with self. So self-centered, self-righteous, self-seeking. All of these things that are they come about because of individualism, and so you can see the negatives that are wrapped up in that. I think again the fact that it ignores the communal aspect of life, and that we need other people. That's one of the biggest downfalls. But then also that it puts us at the center for when anytime anything good happens. We're the reason for that good thing happened because I worked harder than other people. I have what I have. Well, some of that can be true. That's, again, the personal responsibility. We need to take personal responsibility, but it denies that a lot of, even if you were to take a very secular worldview, if you were not to take a faith-centered worldview, it denies the fact that there is what would, from that perspective, then be a lot of random chance that happens. So if a good thing happens to you, you miss all the connections and the web that actually created the ability or the possibility for that good thing to happen. Including the fact that you probably, if good things are happening to you, the likelihood is that your parents and their parents before them set the stage for a lot of the good things that are happening in your life. And maybe put the right kind of values in you. But what about the other people that don't have that? And so individualism can create all sort of problems when you start to flesh it out that way.
Well, and to be clear with this too, we're not going to be able to avoid individualism. That's I think if you've on any of these things, that's maybe the bedrock of our culture, that a lot of these are able to grow out of that.
Yes.
But then the question with that is then what impact is individualism having on you? How is that shaping you? We're in our culture. We're going to be a part of that. Individualism is the bedrock of it. But how is that shaping you? And without thinking of it, without realizing what individualism is, we may not realize that it's shaping us, that it's shaping what we value, the way we think. Whether or not you think I should give to this person who's in need because you think, well, they made their choices and they clearly messed up in their life, so they're not really worthy of being given. There's little things like that where it puts a really big impact on shaping us.
Yes, yeah, I think we when we embrace an individualistic mindset, we often elevate our own standing, and in doing so, we diminish the standing of others. And that's very problematic when we're trying to embrace a biblical worldview that everybody is made in God's image. When you level the playing field like that we're all made in God's image, and beyond that, we're all broken as well, that really truly levels the playing field. And so, but individualism makes it hard to embrace those very core and central truths that are rooted in a biblical worldview.
That's good. So number two is consumerism.
Yeah, consumerism. This idea that I, according to Sanford and Wilkins, again, the way that they kind of couch this one is, I am what I own. Man, if that is true, it will create this never-ending pursuit of the next thing. Okay. So if you are defined, or your value is defined, right? So your value in life is defined by what you have and what you own. Man, then the reality is it will never be enough. What you own will never be enough, because you're going to have to continue to pursue the next better and the next bigger thing. And what that will make you do along the way is basically sell your soul. Now, again, the trouble that this creates too is, again, if you have more than many others, you're going to believe that you are better than others, right? So that you have more value, you have more worth than others. So you start to look at different people and you say, well, they don't have as much as I have, therefore their value is X. I have a lot more, and therefore my value is X. Or if you're on the other side of this, the things that you will be willing to sacrifice. I was very confused in my early time. Now I understand, because this is the lived worldview of many people. I think about my early married years. Lori and I were married. We were living in West Virginia, and we would go serve this project, this housing project, where people had very little in one sense, but then it was wild too that they would also have some things that we didn't have. At times. I mean, my first introduction to a flat screen television was in this housing project. So there's a plasma TV, and I'm looking at this thing hanging on the wall. I'm like, what is that? Where did that come from? I'd never seen one before. And with that, as I started to research, I mean, these, they cost like $3,000 at that point in time. And I'm wondering, man, what did these folks sacrifice? And this was a family with young kids. What did they sacrifice so they could have that thing? And why did they sacrifice so they could have that thing? Now, I didn't ask that question at that point in time, but I'm sure they sacrificed to have that particular thing because of the belief that if they could have that thing, it would say something about who they were. It would confirm something about their identity. But then I look at my life, and man, it's true for me too. I want to wear a certain type of clothes because the type of clothes that I wear define who I am, right? I don't want to, I don't want to have too much, but I don't have too little either. And so, I want to be somewhere in there. There's this sweet spot, but even in looking for that sweet spot, I'm accepting that says something about me. Now, when I may accept that other people will think things about me, that's one thing. But when there is intrinsic value that I'm giving to who I am because of what I have, right? When that actually connects with an inner value, that's where I can start to see, that's where I'm exposed myself. I talked Sunday morning about, being a truck guy, and I have to admit, so there was a time where I drove a Toyota Prius for several years because it was the right thing to do. I needed to drive this Prius. It was cheap. It allowed us to kind of get ourselves, in a good position financially to be able to make the step forward, kind of pay off a number of things and then be able to make the step forward and have a truck again. And I can even look at the reality of my life that, man, I was so happy when I drove off the lot with that truck, because now I was me again. Isn't that interesting when you think about that? And there's, it's not that it's not wrong to own a truck. But if my identity is shaped by the fact that I own a truck, and if I feel like less of a person or less of a valuable person because I'm driving a Prius for a time, it just exposes the shaping that has taken place in my own heart, And so, we all know that this is true. I mean, if we dedicate ourselves fully to consumerism, we'll keep consuming, we'll keep consuming, we'll keep consuming. Now, what's interesting about this as well if I could take this and just relate this to the church world also, we know that we have created an environment within the church world, many churches have, where we've created consumers of church as well. And if I like what's happening at this church, and if it keeps me entertained, I'll stay at that church. And if I feel like I'm being fed, or, even kind of what people will say is, I really got a lot out of today's service, or I didn't get anything out of today's service. And what does that reveal when we think that way? It reveals that we become even consumers of our spiritual diet, in a sense, and we value, the better experience, in a sense. And sometimes even the church that we're a part of says something about our identity, or the church that we're not part of says something about our identity. So even in church, in a sense, we have become consumers because it says something about us, because we have this belief that it says something about us. So I am what I own, consumerism. And, just like individualism, it has had an effect on all of us to shape us to some degree.
Yeah, that's good. So the third one is nationalism. And interestingly, we actually missed this one on Sunday. We had a little bit of a technical glitch and skipped over this one. So for those of you who are listening to the podcast, you get a bonus one that you didn't hear in the morning. But talk to us about nationalism.
Yeah, nationalism. The way that, and again, I want you to remember that this book was written in 2009. So this was written before all the conversation that's come up in the last few years about the ideas of Christian nationalism. And so these guys were kind of seeing into the future just a little bit in one sense. But nationalism, the way they define it is this: my nation under God. Now, we would look at that and say, one nation under God, doesn't that define who we are as Americans? One nation under God. But what that does not allow for is the reality that we do live in a very pluralistic society. My nation under God, well, right now we'd have to ask, if that's what you want, we'd have to ask, well, which God? Because we are so diverse when it comes to even our religious leanings. But we also then, have many people who embrace a very secular worldview and don't have any religious leanings whatsoever, or at least claim not to. Nationalism too, I think, starts to fall apart. We talk about what nationalism is first. Nationalism is the idea that my nation is favored. And so I give my nation favored status, which again, this is like individualism. And I think individualism feeds directly into nationalism, because we start to believe that we're at the center. It's just another kind of offshoot of believing that we're at the center of the universe. We now just take that.
Our nation is at the center.
That's exactly right. We just now take that and we put that onto our nation. And so it is not surprising that many Western nations very much embrace this idea, and that it has been in Western society where we've seen some really negative things come out of that. Probably one of the most stark examples of nationalism goes back to Nazism of the mid-late 1930s and into the 1940s as well, where Deutschland über alles was the saying, which is Germany over all, right? Above all. Why? Well, Hitler actually used God to rationalize, to give justification to Germany being overall, and the Aryan nation being the chosen people, in a sense, that they were far superior. Now, that idea was actually tied to evolutionistic thinking, where Hitler and others supposed that people with blonde hair and blue eyes were at the top of the evolutionary chain, in a sense. And so there's a whole hodgepodge of mess that comes together to breed nationalism. But we've seen a resurgence of nationalism in this country as well in the last several years, and even other things thrown and tied to it. But Christian faith, or faith in God, is often paired with nationalism as a justification for my nation is better, my nation is favored. My nation's not just favored by me, my nation is actually favored by God, right? And so then that means we ought to make sure that by any means necessary, if my nation is favored by God, then our nation ought to, through laws and other things, make sure that we're almost legislating the things of God, whether people choose them or not, whether people choose God or not. And so there's a lot of things negatively that flow out of this. And And again, especially the idea of favored status. If we're honest with ourselves, the statistics show right now that there are more Christians in India, now not percentage-wise, but there are more Christians in India than there are in the United States right now. So if God were to go where there are more Christians and say, well, that's the favored nation, then it wouldn't be here for that reason as well. And there's revival happening in countries right now on grand scales, the likes of which we haven't seen in our nation for years. And so where is God's favor? Well, God's favor is with the people who seek Him, not with some arbitrarily drawn borders in some sense. And maybe arbitrary is maybe too flippant a way of describing that, but we have to be honest about nations. Nations come and nations go, but the kingdom of God lives forever. And so if we pursue nationalism as our worldview, I don't think that leads us toward God. I think it often leads us away from God and giving more, even though we say my nation under God, what often happens is my God under my nation. And so, that can be a very dangerous thing.
I feel like too, it can breed a bit of an arrogance to your nation over others. And I wonder, how does that affect that? Jesus' movement is a global movement.
Yes.
How does that affect how you see Christians in other nations? How you see the need to share the gospel in other environments if it's so nation-centric? And it's not necessarily to say you can't love your nation, that you can't prefer your nation. Like that's fine. But I think nationalism goes to a level of arrogance that it is us first above anyone else, and that means at times putting down others in a way that just doesn't seem to align with the gospel.
Yeah, I agree. I used to even embrace the idea of American exceptionalism as determined by God to some degree. I think, and I did it kind of maybe ignorantly or being oblivious to what I was actually thinking and saying, because what you do is you take this very individualistic mindset, then you add to that consumerism, and you start to look at it and say, look, we are at the center of the universe. We have what we have, and what we have defines us. And look at the United States. We're this very wealthy nation. What must that mean? In the end, the conclusion is that we're favored by God. When we can look at many wealthy nations over the course of, was Rome favored by God?
Yeah.
Well, no, Rome was a place of debauchery often, and we would look at that and we would identify that and say Rome was this pagan nation full of debauchery, full of terrible sexual practices and everything else that went with the debaucherous lifestyle they lived, lots of alcoholism and everything else. And would we think that Rome was favored by God? No, we wouldn't. So why do we look at the United States and say, well, we're obviously favored by God? Well, it's, I think, because of a faulty system that puts us at the center of the universe and that makes us believe that all blessing comes in the form of materialism. And so therefore we're defined by what we have. We have it here, so that must mean. It's very problematic because there are so many things, especially even as we were talking about before, the Sermon on the Mount speaks out directly against that. I mean, Jesus is talking about people being poor, being blessed, and poor in spirit. But I think that goes beyond just, I think that can go to a physical reality as well, this idea of being poor in spirit. So, we gotta be careful with that.
Let's keep moving. Number 4, the fourth ideology, it's moral relativism. What is that?
So moral relativism is the idea in a sense that there is no absolute truth, so my truth is as valid as your truth. And especially this connects with our lived reality or how we live out our beliefs, in the sense that we now start to put ourselves, this is tied to individualism in many ways. We put ourselves at the center of the universe, therefore I can determine what is right and what is wrong. We talked about this last year. We define our own truth. We make our own meaning and value and purpose in life based upon our whims, our current feelings. And so there is no moral compass, in a sense. There is no north when it comes to moral compass. What you decide is good for you is not necessarily good for me, so my truth is as valid as your truth. And as we talked about last year in the podcast in January, and also in that message series, that breaks down very quickly when you have your truth and I have my truth, and they're conflicting truths, and now we're going kind of, we start to bump into each other by natural consequence of that. Well, whose truth wins out? Do we just keep doing our own thing? But wait, we can't do our own thing because we've reached this place of incompatibility.
Yeah.
Right? And so, you can see where this one falls apart. You can also see why people are drawn to this because there are so many different, faith systems, maybe you could say, in the world. There are so many different definitions of what provides meaning and value in life, and sometimes people set happiness as the target, and when we set one thing as a target, it moves us into this place of moral relativism because we have to be able to justify why we're shooting what we're shooting, why we're aiming for what we're aiming for, in a sense.
I think there's an instinct there that feels right too. At least I'll say to my generation that it feels like I'm not pushing my views on someone else. I'm not being judgmental. I'm letting someone else believe what they want to believe. So this is fine. There is no real truth. So I'm just going to hold my thing. You do your thing. And so there's an instinct that for me that feels good. That feels like I'm not pushing myself on someone else, and that's a value. So I think there is a seductive nature.
So what is truth, and how do we
compromise
know it?
What is really true in this attempt to feel like we're being non-judgmental and loving to people, putting air quotes around loving, but it's not really loving if it's not what's true.
Correct.
And if we're following a biblical worldview, there is something that is true, so that's not really loving, but it feels like it is at times.
Correct. So we can flip that. I think what we said about moral relativism, there is no absolute truth. So my truth is as valid as yours. If we're being, in a sense, trying to be gracious and humble, we might say, so your truth is as valid as mine. So it does seem as though we're being gracious in that. We're being non-judgmental, and certainly in our world, the outflow of moral relativism is that the biggest sin has become to judge someone else. There is no sin greater than judging someone else's actions. But if there is a moral standard, if there is a moral absolute, and if God is our creator, and if what God has called us to then becomes the standard for truth, if Jesus is the standard for truth, then there is a moral absolute. And so then we have to deal with, what if we know there's a moral absolute? Is it gracious to allow people to continue to pursue their own truth when there is the truth, a truth? When Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, as he defines himself in John 14. And so, again, we can see just logically where this worldview that is moral relativism breaks down all over the place. And people are not happy by just pursuing their own truth and by making their own meaning in life. In fact, we live in a society statistically where, since people have been measuring the happiness index, we're scoring as low as we've ever scored. And we've been trying this thing called moral relativism for several decades now. I mean, going back to probably the 60s and the sexual revolution, and living free and doing whatever we want. And there's been a steady decline in the happiness index since about that time. So that one falls apart on multiple levels. I'm thankful that people are still searching for truth, but we cannot search for truth within ourselves.
Yeah. Okay, we're at the halfway point. Let's go to number 5, scientific naturalism.
Yeah, scientific naturalism. So I enjoy the way that they frame this in the book Hidden Worldviews, to say that scientific naturalism is the belief that only matter matters.
Okay.
The difficulty with that is if we chase that worldview down, or at least where that begins, it's the idea of that we are here by random chance, in a sense. That we just happened to get lucky. We were the lucky ones that drew, we drew the long straw, and because we drew the long straw, we had the right elements in this kind of primordial pool at some point in time where, there were the right basic building blocks for life that just happened to be gathered together, and maybe they were zapped by some sort of, billions of years old lightning bolt that happened to just start this chain reaction that led to protein synthesizing and all this coming together of these building blocks of life, and somehow now we're here as the product of random chance. The difficulty with that is trying to have any sort of significant value proposition in life at that point in time.
Yeah.
So if you're here and I'm here because of random chance means there's actually no real purpose and value to our existence whatsoever. There's no designer, means there's no design, means we just evolved from something that was basically nothing, right? So in a sense, the spin that I put on this when talking about this on Sunday morning was, if only matter matters, and matter is in a sense nothing. It's nothing that can think, right? There's no thought process to matter. Matter doesn't have thought processes. We've developed that through only evolution. If only matter matters, then nothing matters. And that is the conclusion that many have come to, and that's often termed existential nihilism. This idea that really there is no purpose and meaning in life, so why even be here? And I think that is a lot of people that have chased down kind of the end game, or have allowed themselves to continue through the logical progression that begins with scientific naturalism, have landed at this point of nihilism, where there's no reason and purpose in life. There's no meaning to you. You don't have any purpose, and purpose is where we find value. If you don't have value, then why should you even be here? And when we talked about this last year in the first message series of the year, that we're at this place where many people are ending their lives nowadays, not because they have some sort of mental health issue that moves them to despair or completely to be exasperated with life. It's because people are despairing because they believe there's no meaning and purpose in life, so why live, right? And that's what comes as a result of embracing scientific naturalism and the idea that only matter matters. So if only matter matters, again, I'll say it, then nothing matters. Then nothing matters. So that's a tough worldview to embrace.
Yeah. The next one, number 6, is the New Age. What is that?
Yeah, the way they describe this is with this tagline: are we gods, little g, or are we God, apostrophe S? Gods, do we belong to God? So did God create us, or are we, here's what's interesting. We live in an age where people want to embrace some measure of spirituality. They absolutely do, but they look oftentimes at the spirituality that comes from the church, and they say, well, that is very religious and maybe very institutional. So our free thinking age, our free spirit age, wants something different than that. So that's where the New Age arises out of, this attempt to still be spiritual, to be a spiritual being, oftentimes connected to very Eastern mysticism. So it's very mystic, as opposed to maybe somewhat ritual centered at times, which I think that would be what the accusation that would be poked at the Christian faith, or some ways of practicing the Christian faith anyway, that is very ritualistic, as opposed to embracing more the mystical, the experiential in that. And so I think the New Age ideas arrive out of the desire to still be spiritual without being tied to religion, in a sense. And so I can understand that. And there's actually something that I find compelling in that, because sometimes religion removes the relationship that we're called to have with God. It makes our relationship dependent upon doing all the right things and checking all the right boxes. So I understand this desire to want to have an experience with God.
Yeah.
The problem with the New Age is the New Age does not have typically any concept of a personal God, or even necessarily God that created, or the idea of God is very nebulous. Or the idea is that we are all parts of God in one sense. So we are at the heart of things. We are God's small g. And what we need to do is reach this place of enlightenment, and we can ascend to this plane now where we transcend the physical, ascend into the spiritual, and in a sense embrace who we really are. But it gives us a very distorted understanding of the world, because also, again, it puts us at the center. So it's very much rooted in individualism. Yeah. It's very much rooted in the idea of moral relativism as well. It's an attempt to be spiritual while being a moral relativist, while being an individualist as well, without putting yourself under the authority of a God. You can actually become a God yourself, in a sense, and maintain this spiritual connection. Now, there's a whole lot more to the New Age than that we probably don't have time to discuss, but I think that's my best kind of in a nutshell explanation of what the New Age is. And again, the question at the heart of that is, who are we really? What is our identity? Am I a God little g, or do I belong to a God who created me? Big G apostrophe S at the end of that.
All right, number 7 is postmodern tribalism.
Yeah, this is one that we've seen a whole lot here lately. And without digging completely into what postmodernism is, I mean, postmodernism is connected to a lot of these ideas that we've already discussed and fleshed out to some degree, but what you end up...
Very much connected to the moral relativism.
Yeah, very much that. Also individualism to some degree, although it brings a communal aspect back into individualism. But now we start to... The outflow of postmodern thinking is that we start to categorize people by groups. Often they're immutable or somewhat immutable characteristics as well. That's the outflow of that. I mean, we've seen this, and we could say that we've talked about critical theory before and talked about the fact that critical theory is trying to answer some problems that we need to actually be honest about and address oftentimes. Yeah. But the prescription of critical theory is not necessarily a particularly good one, especially that it brings to the surface again this idea of tribalism. Yeah. And so based upon your tribe that's connected to maybe an immutable characteristic, you now have to embrace a certain type of worldview, or it's determined that you do embrace a certain worldview. So based upon your skin color, you should embrace a type of worldview. Yeah. Based upon your gender, you should embrace a type of worldview. Based upon whether or not you claim any sort of gender at all, now you embrace a type of worldview, and we give values to the tribe and the worldview that people are supposed to embrace. Sometimes very positive values to some, and sometimes very negative values to others. And so it's a way of separating people into groups, and there is many times there is this underlayer of a desire to see a more just world, so we could say that's good in there. I mean, if justice is really what people are going after, that can be a good thing. The problem is that idea of justice tied with postmodern tribalism has taken on a whole new nature that is very different oftentimes from biblical justice. And it also seeks to judge entire groups of people instead of seeking to maybe rightly judge the actions of one. And so the actions of one becomes, characterizes the actions of all. Now, we've thought like this for years, honestly. This has just emerged as a prominent worldview within probably the last 4 decades or so. But human beings do think this way. I mean, why have there been tribal conflicts for years, and there continue to be tribal conflicts today? This is just a new way of embracing tribalism. Yeah. And so, I think tribalism at its heart is not, why we should push against it is it's not the vision of God for His people whatsoever, when what God has envisioned, Revelation 7, is people from every nation and every tribe and every tongue. So acknowledging that we are different, but God is bringing all of us together under His banner, in a sense, where this just pushes us further into the tribes. Yeah. And based upon those elevates those differences or suppresses some differences or what. I mean, it's a whole hodgepodge. It's a mess. Again, it's a hot mess all over again. But it is a very prominent worldview that influences the way people think and live.
Yeah. And you can so see it played out in politics.
Yes.
In the way certain groups are catered to, assumptions are made about certain groups. They're going to vote one way or the other. And it's just so clear to see how that postmodern tribalistic mindset has influenced our world.
Yes, yeah. The word that you used on Sunday was this idea of a monolith, and so basically the idea that we can pretty much determine how somebody's going to think or behave based upon their race, their ethnicity sometimes, their gender sometimes. Yep. So it's an embracing of the idea of determinism almost. Like you can know something about somebody, or you can predict their future and their path based upon these, again, somewhat immutable characteristics. Which, if we believe in a God who gave us free will, I mean that just goes against that altogether. And so there's so many places where this falls apart. That's just one.
All right, final one. Yeah. It's kind of an interesting one. Is salvation by therapy.
Yes, salvation by therapy. And they didn't have a label on this one, so I created a label, but I think this is kind of sums up where they're going with it, and also sums up what I've seen is that, this idea that the right guidance can help me find freedom. And people are looking for freedom in this life, freedom from their past, freedom from wounds that have occurred. But man, we see this happening all over the place right now, in that just about everybody on some level, and I don't want to make light of situations where abuse has occurred. There is abuse that has occurred, but we want to be defined by the abuse that happened in our lives at times. So I am a trauma survivor. I am a this. So we're allowing ourselves to be defined by these things, and then we're also hoping that in that therapeutic realm we'll find some sort of freedom. But man, it's some of the things that I'm seeing happening right now are just so counter to what God would lead us to. If you're defined by something bad that someone did to you, and we're called to be people of forgiveness, but you're defined by that thing, by that trauma experience, it's very hard to bring forgiveness into that. If God is the God of healing, then where does healing really truly come from? Does it come from rehashing in therapy? And as a therapist, right? Does it come from rehashing that negative experience over and over again? Or does it come from learning to embrace something better and a bigger reality, or finding meaning even in your suffering, or accepting that this is part of the brokenness of this world? And but when we think we can find salvation by therapy, just talking about our problems over and over again, when we think that maybe setting the right goals from here it goes back to individualism again, believing that we can, but now we're looking to the guidance of someone else to help us be able to, when the reality is that there are some things that we can only be freed from by turning to God and handing those things over to Him, that you can't on your own power. And salvation by therapy still very much says on your own power, with the guidance of someone else who's maybe a little wiser, you can.
I thought it was a really an interesting one that I had not thought of before, but it's interesting that as you tease that out, how I have seen and heard that. I've got a podcast I listen to on a regular basis with a couple of guys who have deconstructed their faith, and I have heard in their story how it almost feels like there has been a replacement of therapy that has kind of replaced a place where
the new
religion was there, where Christianity was there. And that's really an interesting one. And there's also a part of me that wants to be a little careful as someone who, you're a counselor, I've just studied counseling. I believe so highly in that. I went to counseling for several months and found it to be a huge formative thing in my life. But I can see where it could, it's the salvation part of it, to say that this is my salvation, to where it can turn into a new religion of sorts.
It does. Yeah, so the therapists are the new prophets and priests, in a sense, and
it's
we
really
take them our problems and they help us find freedom and help us find salvation in a sense. And it's really interesting, and they, Sanford and Wilkins point this out in the book, is that if we look at this one, where this one starts to fall apart is that we have to start asking the question, well, then how did people survive 100 years ago? Because it wasn't until roughly 100 years ago that therapy and therapeutic practices start to rise, start to come into practice, or start to appear on the scene. And their speculation
they went to the
is
priest, they went to the rabbi.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. So as we move more into this secular age, we still have this problem that we're trying to be delivered from. We've just determined that something new is going to save us. So it's not going to be through a religious pathway. It's now going to be through a therapeutic pathway, which is where, even things like moral therapeutic deism arrive, where maybe we believe there's a God, but we believe that the shaping of our lives happens more through self-help and other things like that, than as opposed to surrendering. So again, the problem at the heart of this is an attempt to take control of my life, where what God would have me do is really surrender my life. So good counseling helps people realize maybe they're not in control and will never be able to take control. And so I hope that's the kind of counseling you and I try to engage in, is to show people, look, there are things that are out of your control that you have to trust and surrender to God, and there's where you will find peace and freedom, as opposed to, this self-help and the next 5 steps that will free me from different things. And so that's where salvation by therapy really falls apart. But it is helpful to see therapists are the prophets and priests of our secular age in a way, very interesting.
So that's the 8 worldviews. That's a lot. That's a lot of information right there. But I'm sure that as you're listening to this, you can probably see how each of these have played out. Maybe you've felt some are stronger forces in your life than others, but I imagine you can see how each of these are alive and well in our culture. And maybe you're starting to wonder how they have influenced you and how they've influenced me as I'm going through this. I've been trying to piece that together. So my question is, you said in the message that we don't always know what's shaping us. We don't know when these things are shaping us. So how do we know? How do we know if we're being shaped? What do we do? How do we know if these things are shaping us?
Yeah, let me restate even what you just said in just a slightly different way. I think if those two things are true, that we don't always know when something is shaping us, and we don't always know what is shaping us, but we know that many things are at work shaping us, then I think we have to accept this next bit, that the assumption that my life is primarily being shaped by God, even if I call myself a Christian, may be false. Ooh. And that's a heavy one.
Yeah, it is.
Is God the primary force at work shaping me? Or because of my lack of awareness of the things that are working to shape me, or because of my sometimes complacency? That's the other piece that we have to be honest about. Being shaped by God, or allowing oneself to be shaped by God, it involves intent and purpose. It doesn't just happen.
I think sometimes some of these forces, as we've talked about, can even be conflated to think that is God shaping me.
Right, yes. I think that's true.
Our nation is, it's the Christian nationalism idea. It's even individualism. It's some of these things that we can even conflate these things and not even see that's a worldview of my culture. Yeah. That's not God. That's not from Jesus.
Yes. Again, and it's the good things, because there is a measure of truth.
Yeah.
Or
just about every one of those.
Just about every one of these. Again, to accept personal responsibility is, I think, an idea that's biblically rooted. Yeah. To choose to work hard, again, is an idea that I believe is biblically rooted. Yeah. So there are these ideas that are biblically rooted that even connect with this idea of individualism. But when you start to think that because I work hard, or because I have a lot of things, or because I've achieved a certain level of success, I must work harder than everybody else. Or I must be a better person than everyone else. So that's individual. That's kind of like that's at the crossroads of individualism and consumerism. That kind of is the natural outflow of embracing those two beliefs. And so, again, there is some truth in each one of these. And that truth can become the means by which we justify embracing the whole worldview, the rest of what comes with it.
Yep.
So, I think the question was something along the lines of, how can we know when we are being shaped?
Yep.
Well, we just need to make the assumption that you are being shaped. By probably somewhat each one of these to some degree has had an influence upon you, an impact upon you. And maybe not every one of them. Maybe you would look at them and be able to say, I don't think I'm really influenced by that at all. For me, the New Age, there's no appeal in that whatsoever. So, but I can still, I can still admit that some of the ideas that move people toward embracing New Age thought have an influence upon me. The idea of moral relativism, I think, probably has an influence upon me at times. Where I do wonder. But then I know I return to this knowledge and understanding that yes, God has created a moral absolute, and we ought to follow. Truth is found in only Him. And so, but I think we just ought to start with the assumption. How can we know? Sense. We all are. Bottom line, life is as we said, it's a series of experiences. Life is a process of being constantly shaped by, whether it be these different worldviews, the relationships we have, everything is competing to shape you always. Which is why we're asking the question, what's shaping you? Because there are so many things at work constantly shaping us. So just start with the assumption that, bottom line, you're being shaped by these things, especially if you're not making a conscious choice to try to be always evaluating yourself. We're being shaped.
So as we bring it to a close, what can we practice out of this week? How can we practice what we've learned to be faithful to Jesus?
Yeah, so, I'll just say, as a therapist, the therapeutic approach I probably embrace most, which is one that's being pushed against by a lot of people in therapy, especially those who embrace kind of a postmodern worldview, is that of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's helping people understand, exposing what's actually going on, and then giving tools to be able to maybe make the right steps forward or to think in a different way. So we're changing the way people think. So we're giving new knowledge, and out of that new knowledge and understanding, hopefully comes new life practice. Well, I think that ought to be true here as well. And in fact, that I think cognitive behavioral psychology actually connects back with Scripture. As we think in our hearts, so are we. So as we refuse to think in our heart, so are we too. So the places where we're complacent, well, there's a natural outcome of our complacency. And so I would say, how can we practice what we've learned to be faithful to Jesus this requires some time of self-reflection. To try to understand how much am I shaped by an individualistic worldview, a consumerist mindset. How much am I shaped by moral relativism? Any one of these, am I being shaped by this? How much do I believe that salvation can be found through therapy, or is salvation found in God alone? How much of these ideas that we've talked about today, what kind of an influence do these ideas have upon me? And then the second part of that is, am I putting myself in a place where I am intentionally, purposely being shaped by God? Because that doesn't just happen by accident. So to engage in some of those very formative spiritual practices, like daily Bible reading, daily prayer, what we're doing right now, prayer and fasting, listening to the ideas of others' thoughts about God, based upon their time in study. All of these practices that we can engage in that will enrich our lives, yes, but that will shape us so that we become the people that God wants us to become, so that we look more like Jesus in the end. And so maybe if we can accept, again, as was said about, the millennial generation, that they are being influenced at a rate of 20 to 1, when it comes to ideas in the world, media content of the world, and content that would be connected with God. We can try to reverse some of that trend and say, I'm going to give up, I'm going to intentionally eliminate some of those places where these other ideas are impressing themselves upon me, to return to the one thing, the one person who I really want to be impressed. I want God to impress him. It started with his fingerprint. I want him to continue to leave his mark on my life. I want him to shape me more than anything else. So that's a conscious choice. We have to make that choice. The question is, are we going to make that choice?
That's good. That's good. Good question to leave it on. I think good challenge to leave us on for this week to go through, spend some time reflecting on these, reflecting on how they're shaping you. So I look forward to next week, to diving further into this content. Part 3 of this series. We invite you to join us again. If you're local, invite you to join us Sunday morning at Grace Chapel. Otherwise, tune back in to next week's episode of the podcast. And we look forward to hearing from y'all again.